I was trimming the hedges along the front walk when my son-in-law's car pulled into the driveway. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September, one of those crisp Ontario days where the air smells like wood smoke and dried leaves, and the sky goes that particular shade of blue you only see in the fall. I had my old canvas gloves on, the ones with the torn left thumb, and I was wearing the green jacket I'd bought at a garage sale in Barrie about 15 years ago. It still fit. I've always been careful about that kind of thing. My daughter Claire was inside making tea. I could see her through the kitchen window, moving around in that efficient way she has. The way she's moved since she was a little girl, always purposeful, always in motion. She gets that from her mother. The car was a black BMW, new enough that the plates still had that factory shine. My son-in-law Marcus got out first, and then his mother Diane climbed out from the passenger side, adjusting her coat and looking at the garden the way people look at things they don't quite understand but feel they should have an opinion about. Marcus didn't look at me right away. He was checking his phone, one hand on the car roof, thumbs scrolling. Then he glanced up, saw me crouched by the hedge, and gave me the kind of nod you give to someone whose name you can never quite remember. "Gordon," he said. That was all. Not, "Hi, Gordon." Not, "Good to see you." Just my first name, the way you'd acknowledge a lamppost you'd passed before. His mother smiled at me, a careful smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "The garden looks tidy," she said. And then they both walked past me and into the house without waiting. I went back to the hedges. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters for what comes later. I am not a man who needs to be recognized. I spent 34 years building something, and I spent most of those years learning that the work itself is the reward. My late wife Patricia always said that about me, that I was the only person she knew who could be genuinely happy with an audience of zero. She meant it as a compliment, mostly, sometimes as gentle criticism. Patricia passed 8 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. She was 61. She would have had a lot to say about Marcus. My daughter Claire met Marcus Whitfield at a real estate conference in Toronto. She was 34, just made partner at her firm, and he was 37, a corporate lawyer with a practice in Mississauga and an apartment in the Distillery District. He was handsome in that polished, indoor way-good suits, good haircut, the kind of man who always knows where the good restaurants are. Claire brought him home to meet me about 4 months into their relationship, and I made dinner, and we sat at the table in the house I'd lived in for 26 years, and I watched him try to figure out what to make of me. I was 62 at that point. I had retired from my actual career about 2 years earlier, quietly, without much ceremony. I'd kept the house in Sudbury, the one Patricia and I bought when Claire was 3, and I was spending my days doing what I'd always done when I needed to think, working with my hands. The vegetable garden out back, the woodworking shop in the garage. I volunteered 2 mornings a week at the library, helping seniors with their computers and phones. To someone like Marcus, this picture read as a complete story: retired man, modest house, old jacket, vegetable garden. He'd filled in all the rest of the gaps himself, and he was comfortable with what he'd filled in. "Claire tells me you used to work in government," he said over dinner that first night. "I did," I said. "For a long time. Municipal level?" he asked. The way he said it made the question sound like a courtesy. "Federal, mostly," I said. "Some provincial work in the early years." He nodded. The way you nod when someone tells you they used to play recreational hockey. Politely interested. Already thinking about something else. I didn't correct him. I didn't add anything. I passed the bread. That was the beginning. The engagement happened 18 months later, on Claire's birthday. Marcus proposed at a restaurant in downtown Toronto, one of those places with no menu on the wall, and a sommelier who introduces himself by name. Claire called me from the restaurant, still laughing, voice high and bright in a way I hadn't heard since she was a teenager. "Dad, we're engaged," she said. I said yes. "Are you happy?" "I'm very happy if you are," I told her, and I meant it. I meant it completely. Whatever I thought of Marcus, I knew that Claire had arrived at this moment through her own clear eyes and her own good judgment. She was not a woman who made careless decisions. If she believed in this man, then there was something worth believing in. I trusted her. It was the engagement party where I first understood how Marcus talked about me when Claire wasn't listening. The party was held at a venue in Oakville, a converted boathouse on the lake, strung with lights, 60-something people standing around with champagne glasses. Claire's friends from the firm, Marcus's colleagues and university friends, his parents, Diane and Gerald, who'd driven up from Burlington, a few of Claire's cousins, who I hadn't seen in years. I wore my suit. I own one good suit, dark charcoal, bought for Patricia's funeral, and worn perhaps 4 times since. I got my hair cut the day before. I shone my shoes. I am telling you this not because it matters to me, but because I want you to understand that I was not careless about the occasion. I was present. I was trying. What I was not doing was performing. And I think that was the problem. About an hour into the party, Marcus gathered everyone for a toast. He stood at the front of the room with a microphone, arm around Claire, and he was charming and funny in exactly the way a good corporate lawyer is charming and funny, smooth without seeming rehearsed, warm without letting anyone get too close. He thanked people by name, his parents, his partners at the firm, his university friends, Claire's colleagues. When he got to family, he said, and of course, Claire's family is here in spirit. Her mother Patricia, who we wish could be with us tonight. A soft murmur of sympathy around the room. Then he said, and her father, Gordon, who keeps everything running at home in Sudbury. He smiled at me, a brief, public smile. We're glad you made the drive, Gordon. Scattered applause. A few people glanced at me and smiled the sympathetic smile you give the elderly relative who traveled a long way. Then Marcus moved on to the next thing. I stood there with my champagne glass. I want to be precise about what hurt. It was not that he'd said something cruel. It was the shape of the omission. Keeps everything running at home, the language of a man who mows his own lawn and can't be expected to know more. I had become, in his toast, a small and easily summarized thing, a footnote in his own story. Claire caught my eye across the room. She mouthed, "You okay?" And I nodded and smiled, and I raised my glass in her direction. Because that was the truth. I was there for her, not for him. And I was fine. I was fine. But I listened more carefully after that. And what I heard, over the next several months, told me everything I needed to know about Marcus Whitfield. There was a dinner at his parents' house in Burlington, maybe 3 weeks after the engagement party. Gerald Whitfield was a retired bank manager, a decent man, careful and deliberate, who clearly found his son somewhat exhausting. Diane was warmer than her first impression had suggested. She pressed a second helping of roast on me and asked about my garden with what seemed like genuine curiosity. After dinner, the men sat in the living room while the women finished their conversation in the kitchen. Gerald asked me about Sudbury, about whether I'd seen much change in the city over the years. Marcus was on his phone, the way he was always on his phone, and at some point he said, without looking up, Dad was a civil servant before he retired. Federal government. Nothing too exciting. Gerald looked at me. What department? He asked. I worked in the justice sector, I said. Interesting, Gerald said. He meant it. He leaned forward. What did that involve? Before I could answer, Marcus said, still looking at his phone. Policy work, I think. Report writing, that kind of thing. He said it with the certainty of a man who had decided, long ago, that there was nothing here worth investigating. I said, something like that, and let it go. Gerald gave me a look across the room, just a flicker, a small thing that told me he suspected there was more to the story. I liked Gerald. I thought about saying something more, but I didn't. It was not the right moment. I was still figuring out whether a right moment would ever come. What I was not doing, I want to be clear, was testing Marcus. I have heard people tell stories like this and frame the whole thing as a test, as if the person's entire behavior was an elaborate examination set up by the wise elder to sort the worthy from the unworthy. That is not what was happening. I was simply being myself, the same self I have always been. If Marcus had been curious, he would have asked questions. If he had been respectful, he would have waited for answers. What he was, instead, was incurious and certain. And that combination tells you nearly everything about a man. The wedding was in June. Claire had organized it beautifully, a ceremony at a conservation area north of Toronto, with a reception at a heritage inn nearby. The weather was perfect, the kind of warm, golden Ontario June day that feels like a gift. Claire was luminous. I'm her father, so I'm not objective, but I watched the people in the room watching her, and I know I was not alone in that assessment. I walked her down the aisle. She held my arm tightly, and at one point she leaned over and said quietly, "I'm glad you're here, Dad." And I squeezed her hand and told her I wouldn't be anywhere else. The reception seating was where things went sideways. I don't know whose decision it was. Claire would tell me later that she had left the final seating arrangements to Marcus and his mother because she was overwhelmed with a dozen other things in the final week before the wedding. I believe her. I know my daughter. I was seated at a table near the back of the room, table 11. I was seated with two of Marcus's colleagues from the firm who were there alone, a second cousin of Diane's who had flown in from Calgary and didn't know anyone, and an elderly aunt of Gerald's who was hard of hearing and had brought her own cushion. It was fine. I made conversation. The Diane's cousin was interesting. She'd spent 20 years in environmental law in Alberta. The colleague on my left had been a competitive rower in his 20s and talked about it with the specific melancholy of someone who still measures time in before and after. I listened. I ate my dinner, but I watched the head table, where Marcus sat next to Claire, relaxed and proprietary, holding court with his groomsmen, and I understood something that I had been slow to understand. It was not that he had put me at table 11. People make logistical decisions under pressure, and sometimes the results are imperfect. What struck me was that he had never, not once, indicated to anyone in his world that Claire's father was someone who warranted being known. In his version of this marriage, I was the quiet man from Sudbury who kept his lawn mowed and occasionally made the drive, and he had never thought it was worth revising that version. After the wedding, Claire and Marcus spent 2 weeks in Portugal. I drove back to Sudbury, and I sat in the kitchen for a long time that first evening, drinking tea and listening to the house settle around me. Patricia's photograph is on the shelf above the fireplace, her at 53, laughing at something off camera, squinting into the sun. I talked to her a bit. I do that sometimes. I told her what I'd noticed, and what I was thinking, and what I had decided. What I had decided was nothing. I had decided to do nothing. I was not going to manage this situation, or engineer an outcome, or maneuver toward any particular revelation. I was going to be exactly who I was, and whatever Marcus eventually ran into was his to run into. Patricia, I am quite sure, would have approved. The years that followed settled into a rhythm. I saw Claire and Marcus every few months, holidays, birthdays, the occasional long weekend when they drove up to Sudbury. Marcus was always polite in the careful way of someone who has decided that politeness is a sufficient substitute for attention. He remembered my birthday, reliably, with a bottle of Ontario rye, always a good one, always exactly as expensive as you'd expect from a man making his income. He asked how the garden was doing. He told me, occasionally, about cases he was working on. The way you describe a job to someone who won't understand the technical details, but will appreciate being included. He called me Gordon, only Gordon, never Dad, which Claire had gently suggested might be nice. Once, and never, under any circumstances, sir, which I neither needed nor wanted, but which would have indicated, at minimum, that the possibility had occurred to him. I noticed all of this. I stored none of it as grievance. Grievance is a heavy thing to carry, and I have found, over 60-odd years, that it tends to poison the person, carrying it far more than the person it's aimed at. But I watched. You learn a great deal by watching. There was a moment, about 2 years into their marriage, that I think about sometimes. Claire and Marcus were visiting for Thanksgiving, and Marcus was sitting at the kitchen table while I was cooking, and he took a phone call from someone at his firm. I was at the stove, and I wasn't paying particular attention, but I heard him say, as if summarizing something for the benefit of the person on the line, "I'm at my in-laws' place in Sudbury. Just family stuff. The usual." He said it with a specific flatness, not unkind. Just completely without curiosity or warmth. Just family stuff. The usual. Claire came into the kitchen a few minutes later and started helping me with the potatoes, and I looked at her and thought about what she deserved. She deserved someone who found the world interesting, someone who found her family interesting, someone who paid attention. But that was not my decision to make. 3.5 years into the marriage, Marcus was appointed as the lead corporate counsel on a significant real estate development project in northern Ontario. It was a big deal for his firm, a mixed-use development involving municipal land, conservation easements, First Nations consultation requirements, and about 40 other complicating factors that made it exactly the kind of file that could make or break a career. He mentioned it to me at Christmas dinner. He was proud, and justifiably so. It was a genuine achievement. The hearings in January, he said, Regional Planning Tribunal, should be fairly routine. But with files like this, there's always the risk something unexpected comes up. What region? I asked. He named a municipality about 2 hours north of Sudbury. I said, I know that area fairly well, and he nodded in the distracted way that meant he had already moved on in his mind. In early January, I drove down to Toronto for what had become an annual thing, a lunch with a few old colleagues. People I'd worked closely with over the years and stayed in touch with. We met at a place near King Street, 4 of us around a table, and we did what people who've worked together for a long time do. We ate good food and argued gently about old decisions, and caught each other up on what our children were doing. One of my colleagues, a woman named Beverly Nakamura, who'd worked beside me for 11 years and remains one of the sharpest people I've ever known, asked how Claire was doing. She's well, I said. Her husband is in the middle of a big file. Regional planning hearing, Northern Ontario. Mixed-use development. Beverly looked at me over her coffee cup. Which tribunal? I told her. She set her cup down and smiled, slowly. Gordon, she said. You know who's presiding over that one, don't you? I did know. I had known since Christmas. I had simply been sitting with it, the way you sit with something that is not yet your business. Yes, I said. I know. Beverly laughed her quiet, precise laugh. Does your son-in-law know who you are? He knows I'm Claire's father, I said. That's about it. She laughed again, and shook her head, and ordered us both a second coffee. The hearing was on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of January. I drove down the night before and stayed at a small hotel near the Civic Center. I got up early, had a quiet breakfast, read the paper. I have a ritual before these things. I have had the same ritual for going on 20 years. It steadies me. I got dressed. I put on my robes. I walked from the hotel to the hearing room. I want to tell you what I was thinking as I walked those 3 blocks, because I think it matters. I was not thinking about Marcus. I was not thinking about table 11 at the wedding reception, or the engagement party toast, or the Christmas dinner phone call, or any of the small accumulations of the last several years. I was thinking about the file. I was thinking about the conservation easement issue that I'd read about in the pre-hearing materials, which was genuinely complicated and which I wanted to approach carefully. I am a justice of the Ontario Superior Court. I have been for 19 years. Before that, I spent 15 years as a Crown attorney, and before that, 3 years articling and in private practice. I was appointed to the bench at 44. I have presided over approximately 3,000 cases. I try, in each of them, to be exactly the same person I was when I was trimming Claire's hedges in September, attentive, unhurried, unimpressed by performance. I sat down on the bench. The clerk called the room to order. I looked out at the council tables. Marcus was sitting at the applicant's table, second chair, in a suit I recognized as the charcoal one he'd worn to their 2nd anniversary dinner. He was reviewing his notes, his pen moving, entirely focused. He was good at his job. I had never doubted that. He looked up when the clerk called the matter, and he saw me. I watched it happen in stages. First, the look you give to the bench when a hearing is called professional, practiced, a quick read of the panel, then the slight hesitation, then the second look, slower, more careful, then the stillness that comes when the brain has registered something it does not yet know how to process. His lead counsel, a senior partner I did not know, was already on her feet, introducing the parties. Marcus sat there for a moment longer than he should have. His pen stopped moving. I said, "Good morning. I've reviewed the pre-hearing materials in this matter. Before we begin, I'll note for the record that the applicant's second chair, Mr. Marcus Whitfield, is the husband of my daughter, Claire Mercer. I don't believe this gives rise to a conflict that would require my recusal, as I have no interest in the substance of this application. However, I'm disclosing the relationship in the interest of transparency. If any party believes this warrants further consideration, you may raise it at this time." The room was very quiet. Marcus's lead counsel said, carefully, "No objection from the applicant, Justice Mercer." Opposing counsel said the same. "Very well," I said. "Let's proceed." I conducted the hearing the same way I conduct every hearing. I was thorough. I was fair. I asked questions that I believed needed asking. I gave both sides time, and I listened carefully, and I made no decisions that afternoon that I would not have made in any other matter. The conservation easement issue was as complicated as I'd anticipated, and I made a note that additional submissions would be needed before I could rule. We adjourned at 4:30. As the room cleared, Marcus remained at the counsel table for a moment. His lead counsel had stepped out. He was gathering his papers, slowly, with the careful movements of someone making sure their hands are steady. I came down from the bench. I had no obligation to speak to him, and he had no obligation to speak to me. But I have always believed in not letting silence do the work that words should do. "Marcus," I said. He stood. He looked at me differently than he had ever looked at me. Not with fear, he is not a fearful man, but with something that I recognized after a moment as recalibration. The look of a person updating a model that had been running on incomplete data. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't," I said. "Why didn't you?" He stopped. Started again. "Claire didn't tell me. Claire didn't think it was relevant to tell you," I said. "She was right. It isn't relevant. What I do for work has no bearing on whether I'm worth knowing." He was quiet. "You've been unfailingly polite to me, Marcus," I said. "I want to give you that. You've always been polite." He nodded slowly. "Polite is not the same as present," I said. "There's a difference. You might think about that." I picked up my briefcase. I walked to the door. At the threshold I turned back, because there was one more thing. "For what it's worth," I said, "Claire loves you very much. That was never in question. The question has only ever been whether you understood what you had." I went back to my hotel. I called Claire that evening, as I always do when I'm in the area. I did not mention the hearing. She told me about her week, a file she was working on, a friend's new baby, a problem with the car. Normal things. Good things. I listened and I asked questions, and I meant every word. It was about 3 weeks later that Claire called me on a Sunday afternoon, which is not when she usually calls. Her voice was even the way it gets when she is working through something carefully. "Dad," she said, "Marcus told me about the hearing." "Did he?" "He told me he didn't know, that he'd never thought to ask." She paused. "He was upset, I think. Not angry. More like embarrassed." "That's fair," I said. "He asked me some things about you," she said. "About your career. About who you are." "What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth," she said. "Everything. The appointments. The years on the bench. What you did before that." She was quiet for a moment. "I thought he knew, Dad. I assumed he'd asked." "I never thought." "Claire," I said, "you didn't do anything wrong." "I know," she said, but her voice had something in it that I recognized from when she was very young, a particular disappointment, not in me, but in a situation that had revealed itself to be something other than she'd believed. "How are you?" I asked. Not about the conversation, not about Marcus. Just, how are you? She thought about it honestly, the way she does. "I'm okay," she said. "I'm thinking." I told her to take her time. I told her I was always there. I did not tell her what to think or what to decide. That is not my job, and it never has been. Over the following weeks, I learned, in pieces, what had happened between Claire and Marcus after that conversation. He had apologized to her for the seating at their wedding. He'd apologized for the engagement party toast. He had said, and I have to give him some credit for this, because it is not a small thing for a man like Marcus to say that he had been arrogant, and that his arrogance had been born of a kind of laziness, a willingness to fill in blanks rather than ask questions, and that he was sorry. Whether that apology was enough, I did not know. That was between them. What I know is this. Claire came up to Sudbury by herself in March, without Marcus. She stayed for a long weekend. We cooked together, and we went for long walks, and we sat in the evenings by the fire the way we used to when she was in her 20s and coming home after hard weeks. We talked about her mother. We talked about what Claire wanted from her life, not from her career, not from her marriage, but from her actual daily life, moment to moment. She did not tell me what she had decided, but she was clear-eyed in a way that told me she had decided something. The following October, Claire called to tell me that she and Marcus were separating. She said it calmly and without drama, the way she does things. She said they had tried, that Marcus had tried, but that something had shifted, and she didn't think it was fixable. She said she was sad but not broken. She said she wanted me to know before anyone else did. I told her I was sorry it had come to this. I told her she was brave. I told her the house in Sudbury had a guest room that would always be hers whenever she needed it. She cried a little. I did too, quietly. Patricia would have cried openly and then made tea and then said something that made Claire laugh, and I have never fully forgiven the universe for taking that from us. But we managed. We always manage. Marcus sent me a letter, actual paper, in an envelope, which told me something about how he'd been raised that I hadn't paid enough attention to before. He thanked me for how I had conducted myself at the hearing and in everything after. He said he hoped I would not think too badly of him. He said he had learned something that he didn't know how to fully put into words yet, but that it had to do with the difference between seeing people and categorizing them. He said he would try to do better. I wrote back. I told him I didn't think badly of him. I told him that most of us spend a significant portion of our lives filling in blanks about other people, and that the only real virtue is being willing to revise when the evidence demands it. I told him that Claire was the best person I knew, and that if he understood that, truly understood it, then something good had come out of all of this. I meant every word. I want to tell you one more thing, because I think it is the thing that matters most. About a week after Claire's March visit, I was in the woodworking shop in the garage, working on a side table I'd been building for about 3 months. It was late afternoon, the light coming in at that low winter angle that makes everything look amber. I had the radio on, quietly, and I was sanding the tabletop, paying attention to the grain, and I thought about what I would want a person to take away from all of this, if I were ever to tell it. It is not about what I do for work. It never was. A man who works maintenance at a building deserves the same attention, the same genuine curiosity, the same willingness to be surprised, as a man who sits on a court. If the only lesson Marcus Whitfield took from that January morning was, treat people well because you don't know who they might be, then he missed the point entirely. The point is, treat people well because they are people. That is the whole of it. I have presided over thousands of cases, and I have watched thousands of people walk into a courtroom carrying their full complexity, their histories, their losses, their unexpected dignities, and I have watched other people in those rooms try to summarize them in a sentence. Good lawyers don't do that. Good people don't do that. Patricia knew this by instinct. She could talk to anyone, anywhere, for 10 minutes, and come away having found the most interesting thing about them. She was never performing interest. She was genuinely, constitutionally interested in people, and they felt it, and they opened up, and she came home and told me about the man she'd met at the post office, who had spent 40 years as a lighthouse keeper, or the woman at the grocery store whose grandmother had come to Canada with $12 and a winter coat in 1953. She remembered their names. She asked follow-up questions the next time she saw them. That is the kind of attention I am talking about. That is what was missing. Claire has it. She got it from her mother, and she has never lost it. I think that, more than anything else, is what Marcus failed to see. Not my career, not my title, but the thing that raised her. The side table is in my kitchen now. I use it every morning, putting my coffee cup on it, and sometimes I look at the grain of the wood and think about patience, about the difference between things that are rushed and things that are allowed to take the time they need. Some things cannot be hurried. Character is one of them. Love is another. Justice, when it works the way it's supposed to, is a third. You cannot shortcut any of these things. You can only show up and pay attention and be willing to revise what you think you know. I am 66 years old. I have made many mistakes. I have been wrong about people I was certain I understood, and surprised by people I had badly underestimated. Every time it happens, I try to receive it as a gift rather than an embarrassment, because the moment you stop being surprised by people is the moment you stop really seeing them. My daughter is doing well. She has a new apartment in Waterloo, and a cat she named after a case she argued, and won at 31. She comes to Sudbury 4 or 5 times a year and stays in the guest room, and we cook together, and we go for walks, and we sit by the fire. Marcus, from what I hear, is doing the work I hope it takes. People can change. I have seen it happen, in courtrooms and in kitchens both, and I have never stopped believing in it. The garden is coming in well this year. I planted heritage tomatoes along the south fence, the way Patricia always wanted, and they are doing better than they have any right to in this climate. Some things take longer than you expect. That's all right. That's more than all right.